Series about more than splitting the difference, about exploring the future of a new evangelicalism, maybe a radical evangelicalism that breaks beyond the kind of conservative right and the more progressive left that tries to think beyond these categories. And we were talking about how we need this because sometimes we think maybe we could just split the difference between an evangelical heart and a mainline Protestant brain and kind of put those two together, and then we'll have a great time. And so we've been looking into doing something more than just splitting the difference. And so today we're on our kind of third main signpost as we talk about in prodigal Christianity, or the third main area of investigation, which is God. Who is God? Who is this God that is on mission? Which is a little bit different than asking what is God's mission and how does God go about accomplishing that mission, which we're going to get into later. And so I'm really speaking in broad strokes, but there's two popular tendencies, I think, when it comes to God's mission. The first one is to think that, God is really this distant star that is wholly transcendent. It's really beyond us. But we can take our bearings from this distant star and kind of in our ship traveling through the seas and the ocean of life, we can look at the star, get our bearings, and know kind of how to go and how to live and what to do. And in my mind, I kind of call this the Star Wars theory of God, such that, a long time ago, far, far away, God was doing something. But thankfully, we've been told about it, and so now we can live into it and respond to it and live a certain way. But how exactly God and God's Son and then God's Spirit live into our daily lives can be, kind of a mystery or a little confusing or kind of a letdown. And so one view of God's mission is that God is a distant star, and we navigate through this life through taking our bearings from that. I think there's kind of been a pushback from that one model, and now we're kind of we view God. There's this tendency to view God as the everywhere God. God is kind of everywhere. This is what I call the Matrix God. The Matrix is everywhere. The famous scene of this movie, it talks about how the Matrix is when you wake up, it's there, and when you fall asleep, it's there. When you go to church, when you pay your taxes, when you fall in love, the Matrix is there. It is everywhere. And so rather than a sovereign God who's above all things and beyond all things and kind of has a plan for your life, vaguely, but he really has a plan for accomplishing God's purposes. Instead of that, we have this everywhere God, kind of this God around us. And yet it's often very vague. It's very ambiguous about who this God is and what this God is doing. And so instead of navigating by a distant star, we're kind of within this all-enveloping cloud, maybe a fog, that's close enough to touch. And when we do that, when we kind of just reach out, we find out, oh, God's already there. God's already doing something. Now, I think there's problems with both of these views. One is that God becomes very detached. The other is that God can end up being anything. And how we make a distinction between what is God and what is not, what is God's purposes in the world, and what is evil and more sinister purposes in the world. How can we separate God's true mission from the shadowy semblances if we're kind of in this fog bank? Maybe we get shipwrecked and not even know it. And so rather than the dogmatic affirmations that God is sovereign and everywhere, and rather than kind of the vague affirmation that God's Spirit is in the world, we must remember, as the missiologist Leslie Newbegin has said, that, quote, in proclaiming that God is at work in the world, this is indisputable and absolutely basic for mission. But that proclaiming the reign of God over all events and things must involve some kind of interpretation of what is happening. There must be some kind of interpretation. We know that God's at work in the world, but there must be an interpretation. There must be a way of making sense and getting at what is God's true work and what is not his true work. And so in the second half of this video, I'm trying to break it up because this one's kind of long because we are talking about God after all. But in the second half of this video, we want to talk about that Jesus is the interpretation of the triune God's mission in the world. That Jesus, filled by the Spirit, at work in the world, is the true interpretation of who God is and what God is doing in the world. And we must look to him. And so we're going to talk about his baptism